Welcome to Into Ease. Tonight, we invite you to leave behind the noise of the present and step quietly into the distant past. Get comfortable, relax, and join us as we journey through the complete story of one of history's most fascinating brotherhoods. The Knights Templar. Before there were white mantles marked with a red cross. Before kings trusted them with their fortunes. Before castles, battles, and whispered legends of hidden treasure. There was simply a road. It was not a single road, of course, but thousands of them. Narrow dirt tracks crossed rolling fields in northern France. Ancient Roman highways still stretched across parts of Italy, their worn stones polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Mountain passes twisted through the Alps, where cold winds carried the scent of pine forests and melting snow. Farther south, dusty paths wound across valleys and dry hills, leading toward ports where wooden ships waited to carry travelers across the restless Mediterranean Sea. Tonight, we begin our journey there. Not with famous knights or powerful kings. But with ordinary people. People who left behind familiar homes. People who crossed unfamiliar lands. People who carried their hopes, their fears, and their faith along roads that stretched farther than they had ever imagined. Because long before the Templars became symbols of power, wealth, and mystery, they were simply men who chose to protect those travelers. They were born from the footsteps of ordinary people searching for a sacred destination. And it was this journey, this dangerous road, that would eventually give rise to one of history's most remarkable stories. Imagine the first light of dawn spreading gently across a quiet European village sometime in the early 12th century. Smoke rises lazily from the chimneys of timber houses. A rooster announces the morning long before the church bells begin their familiar song. Bakers are already awake, kneading coarse loaves that will feed families before the day's work begins. Farmers tighten leather harnesses around patient oxen, while children carry buckets from the village well, rubbing sleepy eyes as cool morning air fills their lungs. Everything feels peaceful. Yet among those preparing for another ordinary day are a handful of people whose lives are about to change forever. Some kiss their families goodbye. Imagine the first light of dawn spreading gently across a quiet European village sometime in the early 12th century. Smoke rises lazily from the chimneys of timber houses. A rooster announces the morning long before the church bells begin their familiar song. Bakers are already awake, kneading coarse loaves that will feed families before the day's work begins. Farmers tighten leather harnesses around patient oxen, while children carry buckets from the village well, rubbing sleepy eyes as cool morning air fills their lungs. Everything feels peaceful. Yet among those preparing for another ordinary day are a handful of people whose lives are about to change forever. Some kiss their families goodbye. Some lock the wooden doors of homes they may never see again. Some quietly shoulder a small sack containing little more than dried bread, a wool blanket, and perhaps a tiny wooden cross carved by a local craftsman. Their destination lies thousands of kilometers away. Jerusalem. Even saying its name filled many medieval Christians with wonder. For centuries they had heard stories of the holy city from priests, travelers, and wandering monks. It was the place where they believed Jesus had walked, preached, suffered, and risen again. To reach it was not simply to visit another city. For many, it was the greatest journey a person could make during an entire lifetime. Some believed the pilgrimage might bring spiritual forgiveness. Others wished to fulfill promises made during illness or hardship. A few hoped to thank God for surviving war, famine, or disease. Many simply longed to stand where sacred history had unfolded. But few truly understood what awaited them. At first, the journey seemed almost ordinary. The roads passed through familiar villages where friendly innkeepers offered simple meals of soup, dark bread, and watered ale. Churches welcomed weary travelers, allowing them to sleep on straw beneath wooden roofs while monks quietly recited evening prayers nearby. For a little while, the world still felt familiar. Yet with every passing week, the landscape slowly changed. The villages became less familiar. Languages shifted. Coins looked different. Even the smell of the air seemed unfamiliar as forests gave way to rocky hills and distant coastlines. Many pilgrims had never traveled farther than the nearest market town. Now they found themselves crossing kingdoms whose rulers they had never heard of, speaking to strangers whose words they could not understand. It was both frightening and deeply exciting. Every sunrise revealed another piece of a world they had only imagined. Merchants from distant lands guided camels loaded with spices whose fragrances drifted through busy ports. Sailors shouted across crowded docks while ropes creaked against towering masts. Fishermen repaired worn nets beside harbors where gulls circled endlessly overhead, their cries mixing with the rhythmic crash of waves against stone walls. For many pilgrims, these sights felt almost miraculous. Few people in medieval Europe traveled simply for pleasure. Travel was expensive, slow, often dangerous. Every journey demanded courage. Still, the road toward Jerusalem never truly emptied. Year after year, thousands continued walking. Why? That question puzzled even some people living at the time. What could inspire a farmer to leave behind his fields for months, perhaps years? What could persuade an elderly widow to risk everything for a city she had never seen? What kind of hope was powerful enough to overcome fear itself? The answers were deeply personal. Faith shaped nearly every part of medieval life. Church bells divided the hours. Religious festivals marked the seasons. From birth until death, almost every important moment unfolded beneath the influence of the Church. For many believers, life itself was only the beginning of a much longer journey. That belief gave extraordinary meaning to pilgrimage. Walking toward Jerusalem became more than traveling across continents. It became a spiritual act performed one careful step at a time. Some pilgrims walked barefoot as an act of humility. Others carried staffs decorated with tiny crosses. Many wore broad hats to shield themselves from the relentless summer sun, while heavy wool cloaks protected them from cold mountain winds during winter crossings. They traveled alone. They traveled in families. Sometimes entire groups formed along the road, strangers becoming companions simply because they shared the same destination. Friendships formed surprisingly quickly. Around evening campfires, stories flowed as freely as the simple wine passed between tired hands. One traveler might speak about vineyards in Burgundy. Another described the forests of Germany. Someone else recalled seeing the great churches of northern Italy for the first time. Each story reminded the others how vast their world truly was. Yet beneath these peaceful evenings, uncertainty remained. Every traveler understood that tomorrow's road might be very different. A peaceful valley could become dangerous before sunset. A trusted guide might lose the trail. Supplies could disappear faster than expected. Illness might arrive without warning. Even crossing a swollen river could end a journey forever. Still they continued. Perhaps that quiet determination is one of the most remarkable things about medieval pilgrims. They were not explorers seeking fame. They were not merchants pursuing wealth. Most were ordinary people carrying invisible hopes inside tired hearts. That simple truth often disappears beneath the grand stories of kings and crusades. Yet history is built just as much by ordinary footsteps as extraordinary victories. As the months passed, the roads gradually funneled travelers toward the eastern Mediterranean. Ports grew busier. Ships became larger. The sea itself became another challenge. Unlike modern vessels, medieval ships depended almost entirely upon favorable winds. Storms could delay departures for days or even weeks. Cabins were cramped, food spoiled quickly, and seasickness transformed hopeful excitement into miserable endurance. For many pilgrims, the voyage across the Mediterranean became the hardest part of the journey. The sea possessed a personality all its own. Some mornings it reflected the sky so perfectly that horizon and water seemed to merge into endless blue. On other days, dark clouds gathered with astonishing speed. Waves crashed against wooden hulls, sending icy spray across crowded decks while frightened passengers whispered prayers beneath their breath. Each successful crossing felt like a blessing. When land finally appeared again, cheers often echoed across the ship. The coast of the Holy Land slowly emerged from morning mist. Golden sunlight illuminated rocky hills unlike anything many Europeans had ever seen. Palm trees swayed gently in warm breezes. The air smelled different here. Drier, richer with unfamiliar herbs and spices carried from distant markets. Pilgrims stood silently, trying to absorb the moment. After months of travel, they had finally arrived. But the hardest part of their journey was only just beginning. The first glimpse of Jerusalem rarely looked exactly as pilgrims had imagined. For generations they had listened to sermons describing the holy city as the spiritual heart of Christianity, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Yet medieval Jerusalem was not a city suspended in perfection. It was alive. It was noisy. It was crowded. Its streets were filled with traders bargaining over spices, blacksmiths striking glowing iron with steady rhythm, children weaving through narrow alleyways, and pilgrims speaking dozens of different languages as they searched for places they had only known from scripture. The city carried the weight of centuries. Long before these pilgrims arrived, Jerusalem had belonged to many rulers. Romans had marched through its gates. Byzantine emperors had governed its churches. Muslim dynasties had transformed its skyline with magnificent architecture. Each generation had left its own mark upon the ancient stones, creating a city unlike any other in the medieval world. Few places carried so many memories. Few inspired such deep devotion. As the pilgrims entered through the great gates, many instinctively slowed their pace. Some removed their hats. Others quietly crossed themselves before saying a single word. A few simply stood in silence, trying to absorb the realization that after months, sometimes years, of travel, they had finally reached the destination that had filled their prayers for so long. It should have been the safest place on earth. Instead, for many travelers, Jerusalem marked the beginning of an entirely different challenge. The roads that connected the holy city to nearby ports and neighboring towns stretched across rugged countryside where control could change quickly. Small groups of pilgrims often found themselves walking through lonely valleys or rocky hillsides with little protection beyond faith and determination. Bandits understood these roads well. They knew that pilgrims frequently carried savings collected over many years. Some travelers wore simple clothing, yet tucked beneath their belts were coins intended to support months of travel. Others carried gifts for churches or monasteries. Even those with very little still possessed boots, blankets, animals, or supplies that could be stolen. The danger was not constant. Many completed the journey without ever seeing violence. But uncertainty never truly disappeared. Imagine walking for hours beneath the bright eastern sun, surrounded by only a handful of companions. The nearest village lies many miles behind you. Ahead, the road bends gently around rocky hills where nothing can be seen beyond the next turn. Every distant figure becomes a question. Is it another pilgrim? A merchant? A shepherd? Or someone waiting for travelers exactly like you? Most of the time, those fears faded as quickly as they appeared. A passing caravan might wave politely before continuing on its way. Shepherd boys guided flocks across nearby slopes while monks traveling between monasteries exchanged blessings with strangers they would never meet again. Yet every traveler understood that fortune could change within moments. It was this uncertainty, not constant violence, but the possibility of it, that shaped life for pilgrims throughout the Holy Land. Even after Jerusalem came under Christian control following the First Crusade in 1099, stability remained fragile. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was still young. Its rulers controlled important cities, castles, and roads, but much of the surrounding countryside remained difficult to govern. Armies could defend great fortresses, yet they could not accompany every pilgrim walking dusty roads between sacred sites. The kingdom needed soldiers. But more importantly, it needed guardians. That difference would soon become very important. Soldiers fought battles. Guardians protected journeys. The distinction seems small, yet it would eventually shape one of history's most remarkable organizations. Meanwhile, life inside Jerusalem continued with surprising normality. At sunrise, church bells echoed across stone buildings while merchants unfolded colorful fabrics beneath wooden market stalls. Bakers carried warm loaves through narrow streets, their ovens having glowed since long before dawn. Water sellers called to passing crowds, offering relief from the growing heat. Donkeys patiently carried baskets overflowing with olives, figs, and fresh vegetables harvested from nearby fields. Pilgrims wandered through this lively world with wide eyes. Some hurried toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, hoping to kneel where they believed Christ had been buried and resurrected. Others climbed nearby hills to gaze across the ancient city walls, quietly reflecting upon the long road that had brought them here. For many, these were the happiest days of their lives. Yet happiness often made departure even more difficult. Sooner or later, every pilgrim had to leave Jerusalem. The return journey awaited. And for many, that road proved even more dangerous than the one that had brought them here. Perhaps this surprises us today. We often imagine medieval pilgrimages as a single great adventure ending triumphantly upon arrival. But history rarely follows such neat endings. The journey home could be just as uncertain. Fatigue slowed weary travelers. Money had often been spent. Animals were exhausted. Some pilgrims fell ill after months away from home, while others chose unfamiliar routes in hopes of reaching ports before winter storms closed the sea. Each decision carried consequences. News of robberies spread quickly. A merchant arriving from Jaffa might quietly mention that several travelers had disappeared along a particular stretch of road. A monk returning from Bethlehem could describe abandoned wagons discovered beside a dry riverbed. Sometimes the stories grew larger with every telling. Other times they were painfully true. Whether every tale was accurate hardly mattered. Fear itself changes the way people travel. Small groups merged into larger caravans. Families waited days for companions before continuing their journey. Some delayed departure entirely, hoping conditions might improve. The Kingdom of Jerusalem understood this growing problem. Pilgrims brought more than devotion. They brought trade, money, connections with Europe. Their safe arrival strengthened the kingdom in countless ways. Protecting them became far more than an act of kindness. It became a necessity. Yet who could undertake such a task? The great nobles had armies to command. Kings faced constant political struggles. Local garrisons defended castles and cities already stretched thin across a challenging frontier. Someone else would need to step forward. Not for glory. Not for conquest. Simply to make the road a little safer. History often remembers enormous moments. The fall of kingdoms. The victories of emperors. The signing of famous treaties. But sometimes, everything changes because a small group of people quietly decides to solve an ordinary problem. No trumpets announced what would happen next. No one gathered to witness history. There were no cheering crowds or grand ceremonies that proclaimed a new age had begun. Only a handful of men. And an idea so modest that almost nobody imagined it would echo across the centuries. Within a few short years, pilgrims crossing these dangerous roads would begin noticing something unfamiliar. A few mounted knights. Poorly equipped compared with the great lords of Europe. Quiet. Disciplined. Always watching the road ahead. Few travelers learned their names. Fewer still could have guessed that these humble guardians would one day advise kings, finance kingdoms, build mighty castles, and leave behind one of history's greatest mysteries. But before any of that could happen, they first had to make a promise. And it was that simple promise, made without wealth, without fame, and without certainty, that would begin the extraordinary story of the Knights Templar. History rarely announces the moments that will change the world. There was no great celebration when a small group of knights gathered in Jerusalem in the early years of the 12th century. No armies marched in their honor. No rulers immediately recognized their importance. To many people around them, they were simply another group of men trying to serve a difficult purpose in a difficult land. But sometimes the greatest transformations begin quietly. Among these men was a knight named Hugh de Payens. Little is known about his early life. Like many figures from the medieval world, the details of his childhood have disappeared into the centuries. We do not know the exact moment when he decided to become a knight, or what thoughts filled his mind as he traveled east toward the Holy Land. But by the early 1100s, he had become a respected figure among the small community of Frankish nobles and warriors living in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had seen the realities of the new Crusader states. He knew that capturing Jerusalem was only the beginning. Holding it would be far more difficult. The city was surrounded by uncertainty. The Crusaders controlled important locations, but they were a small population ruling over a vast and unfamiliar region. Their castles stood like islands of stone among landscapes that were often difficult to patrol. Every road mattered. Every traveler mattered. Every journey between towns carried risks. And slowly, an idea began to form. What if there were men whose entire purpose was not to conquer new lands, but simply to protect those who traveled through them? It was not a glamorous mission. There would be no promise of enormous wealth. No guarantee of fame. No certainty that anyone would remember their names. In medieval society, knights often sought honor through victory. They wanted their banners carried into battle. They wanted their achievements sung by poets. They wanted their families to remember their courage. But this new brotherhood would be built around something different. Service. Humility. Discipline. The first group was incredibly small. According to later accounts, Hugh de Payens and several companions presented themselves before the ruler of Jerusalem, King Baldwin II, offering to protect pilgrims traveling through dangerous roads. Traditionally, the founding group is said to have consisted of 9 knights. 9 men. A number that seems almost impossible when we consider what would eventually follow. They did not begin with a powerful army. They did not possess vast estates. They did not own magnificent fortresses. They did not have the wealth that would later make them famous. They were simply knights with a shared belief that protecting travelers could be considered a sacred duty. The world they entered was unlike any military organization Europe had ever known. They were warriors. But they were also monks. This combination was unusual. For centuries, medieval Christianity had often separated these two worlds. Monks withdrew from society to pray, study, and seek spiritual devotion. Knights fought, protected territories, and served powerful lords. The idea that a man could hold a sword in one hand and a prayer book in the other seemed almost contradictory. Yet this contradiction would become the foundation of the Knights Templar. They would live under strict religious rules. They would accept poverty. They would surrender personal wealth. They would obey their superiors. They would place the needs of the order above personal ambition. Their lives would be organized around prayer, discipline, and service. The name they first carried reflected their humility. They were known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A long name for a small group of men. The phrase, poor fellow soldiers, was not accidental. It reminded them of what they were supposed to be. Not wealthy nobles searching for luxury. Not conquerors seeking glory. but servants protecting a sacred road. Their connection to the Temple of Solomon came from their association with a location in Jerusalem believed by medieval Christians to be connected with the ancient temple. This association would later help create the famous name by which they are remembered today: the Knights Templar. But at this moment, they were hardly famous. Most people walking through Jerusalem would not have recognized them. Most kings in Europe had never heard their names. Most historians of their own time would not have guessed that these men were standing at the beginning of one of history's most fascinating stories. Yet there was something remarkable about their timing. Medieval Europe was changing. Pilgrimages were increasing. Trade routes were expanding. Kings and nobles were becoming more connected to the Holy Land. The need for protection was growing. And these 9 knights had placed themselves exactly where history needed them. Their first years were quiet. They guarded roads. They protected travelers. They performed a task that was practical rather than legendary. But legends are often born from ordinary beginnings. A small group becomes trusted. Trusted people receive support. Support becomes wealth. Wealth creates influence. And influence changes the world. The men standing on the roads outside Jerusalem could not have imagined what their decision would become. They could not have known that future kings would depend on them. They could not have known that their castles would stretch across continents. They could not have known that centuries later, people would still debate their secrets, their treasures, and their disappearance. They only knew one thing. The road was dangerous. Pilgrims needed protection. And they had chosen to stand between the traveler and the danger ahead. That was enough. For now. Because the story of the Knights Templar was only beginning. And the most extraordinary part was still waiting. When Hugh de Payens and his companions first offered their service in Jerusalem, they did not look like the beginning of a powerful organization. They did not have the resources of wealthy nobles. They did not command thousands of soldiers. They did not possess the grand castles that would later become symbols of their strength. They were simply a small group of men trying to solve a very real problem. The roads of the Holy Land were dangerous. Pilgrims needed protection. And these knights believed that protecting them was a duty worthy of their lives. But in the beginning, their existence was far from comfortable. The image many people have today of the Knights Templar often comes from their later centuries of power. We imagine white cloaks decorated with the famous Red Cross. We imagine enormous stone fortresses overlooking deserts and mountains. We imagine wealthy commanders meeting with kings and influencing the fate of kingdoms. But that was not how their story began. Their earliest days were defined by simplicity. Their possessions were limited. Their numbers were small. Their future was uncertain. In many ways, they lived closer to the humble monks they resembled than the powerful military order they would become. Their daily life followed a strict rhythm. The day often began before sunrise. While much of Jerusalem remained quiet beneath the darkness, the knights would gather for prayer. Their lives were not organized around personal comfort or ambition. They followed religious discipline designed to remind them that their purpose was greater than themselves. After prayer came the responsibilities of daily life. Weapons needed maintenance. Horses required care. Armor had to be repaired. Supplies had to be organized. A knight's life was never simply riding into battle. Much of it involved preparation, patience, and routine. The sword that protected a pilgrim tomorrow needed attention today. The horse that carried a knight across difficult roads needed food and care every morning. The small details mattered. Because in the dangerous landscape of the medieval Middle East, survival often depended on preparation. Yet despite their dedication, the first Templars faced a difficult question. Could such an unusual group actually survive? Medieval society understood knights. It understood monks. But warrior monks were something different. Some people admired the idea. Others questioned it. Was it truly possible for a person devoted to spiritual humility to also carry weapons? Could fighting ever be considered a religious duty? These questions were not easily answered. For centuries, Christian teachings had emphasized peace, charity, and forgiveness. Yet the medieval world was also one where kingdoms fought constantly, where nobles defended their lands with violence, and where pilgrims traveling to sacred places could face genuine danger. The Templars existed inside this complicated reality. They represented a new idea. That a knight could fight not for personal wealth or glory, but as an act of service. This idea needed support. And that support came from an unexpected place. The first Templars needed more than swords. They needed legitimacy. They needed the wider Christian world to understand what they were trying to create. Without recognition, they would remain only a small group of knights in a distant kingdom. But if the Church accepted them, their future could change completely. The person who would help make that possible was not a warrior. He was a monk. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century. Born in France, he had joined the Cistercian monastic movement, a reform movement that emphasized simplicity, discipline, and devotion. He was known for his powerful writing, his ability to persuade, and his deep influence among European nobles and church leaders. When Bernard encountered the idea of the Knights Templar, he saw something unusual. To many people, they were simply armed men. But Bernard saw something different. He saw a new form of religious dedication. Men who had combined the discipline of monks with the responsibilities of warriors. To Bernard, this was not a contradiction. It was a solution to the challenges of the age. The Holy Land needed protection. Pilgrims needed safety. And these men had chosen to dedicate their lives to that purpose. Bernard became one of their strongest supporters. His influence would help transform the Templars from a small local group into an organization recognized throughout Europe. But before that could happen, the Templars needed something every institution requires. A clear identity. They needed rules. They needed structure. They needed a way to explain exactly who they were and why they existed. A knight fighting for a king was understood. A monk praying in a monastery was understood. But a monk who carried a sword needed explanation. The answer came through a document known as the Latin Rule of the Templars. This rule established how members of the order should live. It described their responsibilities, their behavior, their discipline, their relationship with one another. The Templars were not meant to live like ordinary soldiers. Personal wealth was forbidden. Luxury was discouraged. Their clothing was simple. Their meals were controlled. Their lives were shaped around obedience. Every part of their existence was designed to serve the mission of the order. They were not individuals seeking adventure. They were brothers belonging to something larger than themselves. And this was perhaps their greatest strength. A single knight could disappear. A single warrior could fall. But an organized brotherhood could endure. The small group that had begun as 9 men guarding roads was slowly becoming something much more. Yet the world had not fully noticed them. Their greatest transformation was still ahead. Because soon, these unknown knights would travel beyond the walls of Jerusalem. They would cross the seas back to Europe. They would stand before nobles, bishops, and ordinary people. And they would ask for something that would change their destiny forever. Not gold. Not land. Not power. But support. Because if Europe believed in their mission, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ would no longer be a small group protecting a few roads. They would become one of the most famous brotherhoods in history. For the first years of their existence, the Knights Templar remained almost invisible to the wider world. Inside Jerusalem, they were known by those who needed them most. Pilgrims traveling between sacred sites. Merchants moving along dangerous roads. Travelers who understood the comfort of seeing armed riders appear in the distance, not as threats, but as protectors. Yet outside the Holy Land, almost nobody knew their story. A small group of knights living thousands of miles away was not something that immediately captured the attention of European kings. Europe was filled with competing ambitions. Nobles fought over land. Rulers struggled to strengthen their kingdoms. Church leaders dealt with political conflicts that stretched across the continent. A group of poor knights guarding distant roads might have seemed like a small concern compared with the problems facing Europe itself. But history has a way of allowing small ideas to travel farther than anyone expects. The Templars understood something important. Protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land required more than courage. It required resources. A knight needed armor. A horse needed food. A fortress needed stone, workers, and supplies. Even the most devoted mission could not survive without support. The Templars needed people in Europe to believe in their purpose. They needed donations. They needed recruits. Most importantly, they needed recognition. Without official approval from the Church, they would remain an unusual experiment. A handful of religious warriors with no clear place in the medieval world. But with approval, they could become something entirely different. A permanent order. An institution that could survive beyond the lives of its founders. And so, the Templars began the journey that would transform them forever. They returned to Europe. The same continent that had once sent thousands of pilgrims toward Jerusalem now had the opportunity to support the men protecting those pilgrims. Imagine the sight of them arriving. Not as a conquering army. Not as wealthy nobles displaying their success. But as a small group of disciplined knights carrying a message. Their clothing was simple. Their possessions were limited. Their request was unusual. They were asking Europe to support men who had chosen poverty. At first glance, it almost seemed contradictory. Why would anyone donate wealth to men who rejected wealth? Why would nobles support warriors who claimed not to fight for personal glory? The answer was the power of their mission. Medieval society deeply valued religious devotion. A person who gave land, money, or resources to a religious cause believed they were participating in something spiritually meaningful. Supporting the Templars was not simply funding soldiers. It was supporting the protection of a sacred journey. And slowly, interest began to grow. One of the most important moments came in the year 1129, at the Council of Troyes in France. This gathering brought together important church figures and religious leaders to discuss the future of the new order. Among those present were bishops, abbots, and influential nobles. And perhaps the most important voice in the room belonged to Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard did not simply support the Templars privately. He helped explain their purpose to the Christian world. His writing, often called in praise of the new knighthood, presented the Templars as something extraordinary. Traditional knights, Bernard argued, often fought because of pride, anger, or the desire for reputation. They sought victory. They sought honor. They sought recognition. But the Templar knight was supposed to be different. He was not fighting for himself. He was fighting in service of something greater. This idea was powerful. Because medieval Europe already had a deep admiration for knights. Stories of heroic warriors filled halls and castles. Songs celebrated courage on the battlefield. Nobles dreamed of honor and reputation. Bernard took that familiar image of the knight and transformed it. What if a warrior could pursue not personal glory, but humility? What if a sword could be used not for ambition, but protection? What if military skill could be combined with spiritual devotion? For many people, this was a revolutionary idea. The Council of Troyes officially recognized the Templars and gave them a formal rule to follow. This moment changed everything. The small group that had begun with 9 knights now had something they never possessed before. Legitimacy. They were no longer simply a local group in Jerusalem. They were now an accepted religious order recognized by the Church. And once recognition arrived, support followed. Nobles across Europe began hearing about the warrior monks defending pilgrims in the Holy Land. Some offered land. Some donated money. Some sent sons who wished to join the growing brotherhood. The Templars began receiving properties throughout Europe. Farms. Villages. Buildings. Resources that could support their mission in the East. Their transformation was beginning. But something important happened during this period. The Templars did not become powerful overnight. They were not suddenly wealthy warriors living in luxury. In fact, their identity remained rooted in simplicity. Their success came from discipline, organization, trust. People believed that resources given to the Templars would actually serve a purpose. And that trust would eventually become one of their greatest strengths. Because money alone does not create power. Trust does. A merchant who believed his wealth was protected. A pilgrim who believed his journey was safer. A noble who believed his donation served a sacred cause. All of these relationships slowly built the foundation of the Templar Empire. Yet another transformation was quietly taking place. The Templars were no longer just protectors of roads. They were becoming experts in something medieval society desperately needed. Organization. They created systems. They managed properties. They transported resources. They communicated across enormous distances. The same discipline that helped them survive on dangerous roads would later help them manage one of the most extensive networks in medieval Europe. But before they became bankers, before kings trusted them with treasure, before their name inspired both admiration and suspicion, they first had to prove themselves on the battlefield. Because recognition from the Church gave them a purpose. But only their actions in the Holy Land would determine whether they could survive. And waiting for them there was a challenge unlike anything they had faced before. The roads they protected were dangerous. But the conflicts ahead would test the very foundation of their brotherhood. The recognition of the Knights Templar changed their position in the medieval world. But recognition alone could not guarantee survival. A document from a council could give them legitimacy. The support of powerful church leaders could give them respect. The generosity of European nobles could give them resources. But none of these things could answer the most important question. Could they actually protect the people who depended on them? The Holy Land was not a peaceful kingdom. The Crusader states existed in a world of constant tension. Cities could change hands. Alliances could shift. A road that was safe one month could become dangerous the next. The Templars quickly learned that their mission required more than escorting travelers. They were becoming part of the defense of an entire kingdom. This was a transformation they had not originally planned. They had begun as guardians of pilgrims. But history had placed them in a much larger role. They now stood on the frontier between competing powers. Every castle mattered. Every road mattered. Every messenger carrying information between settlements mattered. And slowly, the Templars developed the qualities that would define them for centuries. Discipline. Organization. Reliability. A knight fighting alone depended on courage. A brotherhood depended on cooperation. The Templars understood that their greatest strength was not any individual warrior. It was the system they created together. A young man joining the order was not simply receiving armor and a sword. He was entering a world with strict expectations. His meals were regulated. His clothing was controlled. His possessions were limited. His daily schedule belonged to the order. Every part of his life was designed to create unity. A knight who served his own ambitions could become dangerous. But a knight who surrendered those ambitions to a shared purpose could become incredibly effective. This idea separated the Templars from many other warriors of their time. Medieval knights were often connected to personal reputation. Their family name mattered. Their achievements mattered. Their victories became part of their identity. The Templars attempted to remove that individual focus. A brother did not fight to make his own name famous. He fought because he represented something larger. The white cloak was not a symbol of personal achievement. It was a reminder of responsibility. And that symbolism mattered. When pilgrims saw Templars riding along the roads of the Holy Land, they did not simply see armed men. They saw a promise. A promise that someone was watching. A promise that someone cared about the dangerous path ahead. That reputation became one of their greatest assets. Trust spread faster than armies. A merchant who heard stories of the Templars might choose to travel with confidence. A noble who saw their dedication might offer support. A young knight in Europe might hear tales of their mission and dream of joining them. The order was growing. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this growth was how quickly the Templars became something more than a military organization. They became a symbol. To their supporters, they represented courage and devotion. They were proof that faith and action could exist together. They were warriors who prayed. Monks who fought. Protectors who lived without personal wealth. Yet this unusual combination also made them fascinating. And throughout history, whenever an organization becomes powerful and mysterious, people begin asking questions. Who are they really? How much influence do they have? What secrets do they know? Those questions would follow the Templars for centuries. But before legends surrounded their name. Before rumors of hidden treasures and forgotten secrets. There was simply a group of men trying to fulfill a difficult promise. Protect the traveler. Serve their faith. Stand where others were afraid to stand. The world had begun to notice them. The Church had recognized them. Europe had started supporting them. And the small brotherhood that began with 9 knights was slowly becoming something much larger. But to truly understand the Knights Templar, we must now step away from the battles and politics. Because the heart of the order was not found only on the battlefield. It was found in the quiet moments. In the hours before sunrise. In the stone halls of their houses. In the meals they shared. In the prayers they repeated. In the rules that shaped every part of their lives. To understand the Templars, we must first understand what it meant to live as one. Before the Knights Templar became a legend. Before their name became connected with kings, treasure, and mystery. They were something much simpler. They were a community. A group of men who had chosen to live differently from the world around them. To understand the Templars, we cannot begin with their castles or their battles. We have to begin with the quiet moments. The hours when no armies were marching. The moments before a sword was lifted. The ordinary routines that shaped their lives day after day. Because power is not created only on battlefields. It is created through habits. And the Templars understood this better than almost anyone in medieval Europe. Imagine waking inside one of their houses sometime during the 12th century. The sun has not yet risen. The fortress is still covered in darkness. Outside the thick stone walls, the world is quiet. The desert wind moves gently across the landscape, carrying the faint smell of dust and wild herbs. Somewhere in the distance, a guard walks along the walls, his footsteps echoing across ancient stone. Inside, however, the day is already beginning. A bell calls the brothers from sleep. Not to begin work. Not to prepare for battle. But to pray. This was one of the most important differences between the Templars and ordinary knights. Their day did not begin with weapons. It began with devotion. The first hours of the morning belonged to God. The brothers gathered together, often in a chapel within their commandery or fortress. They stood side by side, regardless of their background or rank, reciting prayers that had been repeated countless times before. A powerful nobleman stood beside a man who had once been far less wealthy. A knight stood beside a servant brother. Within the walls of the order, their shared purpose mattered more than their previous lives. This unity was deliberate. The Templars were designed to function almost like a single body. Every person had a role. Every person had responsibilities. Every person contributed to the survival of the Brotherhood. A common mistake is to imagine the Knights Templar as thousands of identical warriors wearing white cloaks and carrying swords. The reality was far more complex. The order contained different groups of people. There were Knight Brothers. These were usually nobles trained for mounted combat. They were the warriors most associated with the famous image of the Templar. They wore the white mantle that became their symbol. The color itself carried meaning. White represented purity and dedication. It reminded the wearer that his life was supposed to be different from that of ordinary soldiers. He was not fighting for personal wealth. He was not fighting to increase his family's reputation. He was serving the order. Then there were the Sergeant Brothers. They were equally important, although they did not always receive the same attention in later stories. Many came from non-noble backgrounds. They could serve as fighters, craftsmen, administrators, or specialists. A successful military organization requires far more than knights charging into battle. Someone had to repair equipment. Someone had to manage supplies. Someone had to care for horses. Someone had to maintain the daily operation of the fortress. Behind every famous warrior was a much larger group making that warrior's role possible. There were also servants and workers who supported the order. Farmers grew food. Blacksmiths repaired weapons. Builders maintained walls. Cooks prepared meals. Stable workers cared for animals. The Templars were a religious and military organization, but they existed within a larger world of ordinary people whose labor allowed them to function. This is something often forgotten when we look back at powerful institutions. A castle may appear to belong only to knights and commanders. But every stone wall represents the effort of hundreds of unnamed individuals. Every meal served in a great hall required farmers, merchants, and workers. Every sword carried into battle required someone who shaped the metal long before the warrior held it. The strength of the Templars was not created by knights alone. It was created by an entire network of people. After morning prayers, the fortress slowly came alive. The peaceful silence was replaced by the sounds of daily work. Horses moved in the stables. Metal rang from workshops. Footsteps crossed stone courtyards. Orders were given. Supplies were checked. A fortress was never truly idle. Even during times of peace, preparation was constant. The Templars lived in a world where danger could return quickly. A messenger arriving from a distant settlement could bring news of changing alliances. A patrol returning from the road could report suspicious movements. A request for protection could arrive from travelers preparing to cross dangerous territory. The brothers needed to remain ready. But readiness did not mean constant fear. Their lives were not an endless series of battles. Most days were filled with routine. And routine was exactly what made them effective. A soldier who trains only when war begins is already too late. The Templars understood that discipline was built in ordinary moments. The way a brother cared for his equipment. The way he followed the rules. The way he treated his companions. The way he performed small duties when nobody was watching. These things shaped the warrior he would become. And perhaps nowhere was this discipline more visible than in the meals they shared. Because even eating followed the values of the order. The dining hall of a Templar house was not simply a place where men came to eat. It was another place where the values of the order were expressed. In a world where wealthy nobles often displayed their status through enormous feasts, expensive wines, and elaborate dishes, the Templars followed a very different approach. Their meals were meant to provide what the body needed. Not luxury. Not indulgence. Not a display of personal wealth. The brothers ate together, often in silence or while listening to religious readings. The meal was not just about satisfying hunger. It was another reminder that every part of their life belonged to the purpose of the order. A knight was not supposed to be controlled by comfort. A warrior who became too attached to luxury could become distracted. A brother who accepted discipline in small things would be better prepared for difficult moments. The food itself reflected medieval reality. The Templars did not eat like the exaggerated images of wealthy knights sitting before endless tables of roasted meat and gold cups. Their daily meals were practical. Bread was a central part of medieval life. It was affordable, filling, and easy to store. Vegetables, grains, and simple stews were common. Fish was especially important because religious rules often restricted the consumption of meat on certain days. Olives, fruits, and local foods depended on where the Templar house was located. A commandery in France would have access to different resources than a fortress in the Holy Land. A Templar stationed near the Mediterranean might experience flavors and ingredients that were rare in Northern Europe. This was one of the fascinating realities of the order. Although they were created in the West, they lived in a world that connected different cultures. Their houses existed across Europe and the Middle East. They moved between regions where languages, foods, and traditions differed greatly. A Templar brother might spend years in France before being sent to the Holy Land, where the landscape, climate, and customs felt completely unfamiliar. Yet wherever they went, the rules of the order remained the same. The cloak. The prayers. The discipline. The brotherhood. These things created a sense of identity that traveled with them. Perhaps the most recognizable symbol of this identity was their clothing. The image of the Knights Templar is almost inseparable from the white mantle bearing a red cross. To modern eyes, it looks almost like a uniform. A symbol of a powerful military organization. But to the men who wore it, the meaning was much deeper. The mantle represented commitment. It was a visible reminder that the person wearing it had chosen a different path. A normal knight might display the symbols of his family. His colors. His personal achievements. His noble heritage. The Templar mantle was different. It replaced individual identity with collective purpose. The man wearing it was no longer simply a knight from a particular family. He was a brother of the temple. The red cross that appeared on their clothing became one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval Christianity. It represented sacrifice and devotion. But it also carried a responsibility. Every action of a Templar reflected upon the entire order. A brother who behaved dishonorably did not only damage his own reputation. He damaged the reputation of everyone wearing the same symbol. This pressure created an unusual environment. The Templars were admired because they appeared disciplined. But discipline came with a cost. Their freedom was limited. Personal choices that ordinary nobles enjoyed were often restricted. They could not simply leave whenever they wished. They could not accumulate personal wealth. They could not live according to their own desires. They belonged to the order. And belonging completely to something larger than yourself was one of the central ideas behind Templar life. This same philosophy shaped their relationship with weapons. The sword and armor of a Templar were not symbols of personal pride. They were tools. Important tools. Necessary tools. But still only tools. A sword had to be maintained. Armor had to be repaired. A horse had to be trained. Nothing was taken for granted. A knight's survival depended on preparation. The battlefield was not the place to discover that a strap was weak or a weapon poorly maintained. So much of a warrior's life happened away from battle. The quiet work mattered. The polishing of metal. The repairing of leather. The care of horses. The inspection of equipment. These routines could seem ordinary. But they created the foundation of military success. The Templars became famous partly because they were predictable. A commander could trust them to follow orders. And perhaps this is one reason the Knights Templar became so fascinating. Their story was never only about castles and battles. It was about people who chose a difficult path. Men who gave up comfort for responsibility. Men who traded personal freedom for belonging. Men who believed that protecting strangers was worth risking their own lives. Of course, the reality was not always perfect. The Templars were human. They lived in a complicated world. Like any large organization, they experienced disagreements, mistakes, and internal struggles. The ideal described in their rules did not always perfectly match the reality of daily life. Some brothers followed the principles more closely than others. Some faced temptations. Some struggled with the harsh demands of the order. This is important because history becomes less interesting when we turn people into legends instead of human beings. The Templars were neither perfect heroes nor simple villains. They were medieval people shaped by their time. They lived according to values that made sense in their world. A world where religion, warfare, politics, and survival were deeply connected. Understanding this allows us to see them more clearly. Not as mysterious figures from old stories, but as men standing at the crossroads of history. A knight waking before sunrise. A brother repairing damaged armor. A servant carrying supplies through a courtyard. A commander reading messages from distant lands. All of these people were part of the same living organization. And together, they created something that would become far greater than anyone expected. Because the discipline that shaped their daily lives would eventually allow them to manage something enormous. Something far beyond protecting roads. Far beyond guarding pilgrims. The Templars would soon become trusted with money, property, and responsibilities that reached across kingdoms. A farmer in France might support them. A merchant in Italy might rely on them. A noble traveling across Europe might place his wealth in their care. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the warrior monks were becoming something else. They were becoming administrators, managers, financial experts. The same organization that learned how to protect travelers would soon learn how to protect their wealth. And this transformation would change medieval Europe forever. Because the next chapter of the Templar story is perhaps the most surprising of all. How did a group of poor knights who promised to own nothing become one of the most financially powerful organizations in the medieval world? When people hear the name Knights Templar today, many images come to mind. Ancient castles. White cloaks. Crusader battles. Hidden treasures. Secret chambers. But perhaps the most surprising part of their history is something that many people never expect. The Templars were not only warriors. They were financial innovators. Long before modern banks existed, before international companies connected distant countries, and before people could safely transfer money across borders with a simple transaction, the Knights Templar created a system that helped solve one of medieval Europe's greatest problems: moving wealth safely. To understand why this mattered, we first have to return to the world they lived in. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place for travelers. Not only because of physical threats, but because of something much simpler. Money. Imagine a merchant preparing for a long journey. Perhaps he is traveling from France to the eastern Mediterranean. He needs food, transportation, accommodation, protection, and most importantly, he needs to carry enough money to survive. But how do you carry wealth across hundreds or thousands of kilometers when roads are uncertain and thieves know exactly what travelers possess? The obvious answer was to carry coins. But coins created a serious problem. They were heavy. They attracted attention. And losing them could destroy everything. A merchant carrying a large amount of silver was carrying his entire future on his back. A noble traveling to another kingdom faced the same challenge. A pilgrim might need money for ships, food, lodging, and unexpected expenses. A messenger carrying funds for a ruler could become a valuable target. The medieval world had trade. It had wealth. It had ambitious people traveling across continents. But it lacked something we take for granted today. A safe and reliable way to move money. And this is where the Templars entered an unexpected role. Because the same qualities that made people trust them on dangerous roads also made them trustworthy with something else. Their wealth. Their discipline. Their reputation. Their network. All of these combined to create something new. A system where a person could deposit valuables in one location and access resources somewhere far away. The idea seems simple today. But in medieval Europe, it was revolutionary. A traveler leaving France did not necessarily need to carry bags of coins across dangerous roads. Instead, he could interact with a trusted institution. The Templars maintained houses across different regions. These were not only military bases. They were administrative centers. Places where records were kept. Supplies were managed. Resources were stored. A traveler could leave money at one Templar house and receive documentation allowing access to funds elsewhere. The details varied depending on time and location, but the basic idea was powerful. The journey became safer. The risk became lower. And trust became a valuable resource. But the fascinating part is this. The Templars did not set out to become bankers. They did not wake up one morning and decide to build a financial empire. It happened gradually. The same organization created to protect pilgrims became involved in solving the problems those pilgrims faced. Protection created trust. Trust created responsibility. Responsibility created influence. And influence created power. This pattern would repeat throughout Templar history. Every new role began as a practical solution to a real problem. Their financial activities were not separate from their original mission. In many ways, they grew from it. A pilgrim needed protection on the road. The Templars provided it. A traveler needed a safer way to carry resources. The Templars helped provide it. A kingdom needed reliable administration. The Templars had already developed those skills. Slowly, the order became something much larger than the founders had imagined. But perhaps the most remarkable part was not the money itself. It was the trust behind it. Because in medieval society, trust was more valuable than gold. The growth of the Templar financial network was not built on one invention or one dramatic moment. It grew slowly. Almost quietly. A new Templar house would appear in one region. A donation of land would arrive from a noble family. A merchant would seek their assistance. A traveler would discover that trusting the order made a difficult journey slightly easier. Each individual decision seemed small. But together, these small decisions created something extraordinary. A network. The Templars understood something that many medieval organizations struggled with. Distance was one of the greatest challenges of their age. Europe was not a connected world like the one we know today. There were no instant messages. No telephones. No reliable postal systems available to ordinary travelers. A letter could take weeks or even months to arrive. A journey that looked simple on a modern map could become a dangerous expedition. Moving information was difficult. Moving people was difficult. And moving money was even more difficult. The Templars became successful because they learned how to operate across this fragmented world. Their houses were connected. Their members traveled. Their records were carefully maintained. Their reputation traveled with them. A Templar commandery in France was not isolated from a Templar house in the Holy Land. They were parts of the same organization. This unity gave them an advantage that many medieval institutions lacked. A merchant might trust one local person. But the Templars offered something different. They offered a trusted name across borders. And in medieval Europe, a trusted name was incredibly valuable. This reputation eventually attracted the attention of powerful people, including kings. Medieval rulers constantly faced financial challenges. Maintaining armies was expensive. Building castles required enormous resources. Running a kingdom demanded constant income. Taxes were collected, but gathering and managing money across large territories was complicated. Kings needed reliable administrators. And the Templars had become experts at organization. Their skills were not created by greed. They came from necessity. A military order defending distant territories had to manage supplies, food, weapons, ships, horses, land, personnel. All of these required careful planning. The same skills that helped them survive as a military organization made them valuable in financial matters. They knew how to keep records. They knew how to manage property. They knew how to move resources efficiently. Slowly, rulers began relying on them. The relationship between kings and the Templars became complicated. The order served the church, but it also worked with monarchs. They existed in a unique position. They were not simply servants of one king. They were an international organization with connections across Europe. This independence made them powerful. But it also made them unusual. A noble family could lose influence after one generation. A king could die and be replaced. A political alliance could disappear. But the Templars belonged to something designed to continue. A brotherhood. An institution. A system. This gave them stability. And stability created trust. One of the most interesting examples of Templar influence was their relationship with pilgrims. A person traveling to the Holy Land did not only need protection from physical danger. They needed protection from uncertainty. Imagine leaving your home knowing you may be gone for months. Perhaps years. You carry your belongings. You carry your money. You carry memories of the life you are leaving behind. The journey ahead is unfamiliar. The possibility of losing everything follows you. Now imagine having access to an organization whose members exist in different countries, speak different languages, and share the same symbols and rules. For medieval travelers, that reliability was extraordinary. The Templars represented something rare. A connection between distant places. A bridge between worlds. But their financial success also created a question that would follow them throughout history. How much power was too much? At what point does influence become dangerous? Because wealth changes how people see an organization. A poor group protecting pilgrims could inspire admiration. A wealthy organization influencing kings could create suspicion. The very success that made the Templars respected would eventually contribute to their downfall. But that moment was still far away. For now, their reputation continued to grow. Their estates expanded. Their responsibilities increased. Their influence reached further. And perhaps the most surprising part was that they achieved this without abandoning their original identity. They were still brothers of the temple. They still followed their rules. They still gathered for prayer. They still maintained the discipline that had shaped them from the beginning. The world around them was changing. The order was becoming wealthier. But inside the walls of their houses, the daily rhythm remained familiar. A bell before sunrise. Prayer. Work. Training. Service. The same simple routine that had shaped 9 unknown knights now supported an organization stretching across continents. And soon, the Templars would become something even greater. Not only protectors of pilgrims. Not only guardians of wealth. But one of the most important powers of medieval Europe. The wealth of the Knights Templar has fascinated people for centuries. Some stories describe enormous treasures hidden away before their downfall. Others imagine secret chambers filled with gold and forgotten artifacts. These legends have grown larger with every passing generation. But the historical reality is both more interesting and more complex. The Templars did become wealthy. That much is true. But their wealth did not come from discovering mysterious treasures. It came from something much more ordinary. Organization. Discipline. And the ability to manage what they were given. Much of their wealth came through donations. Medieval nobles often gave land, money, or property to religious institutions. Sometimes it was an expression of faith. Sometimes it was a way to support a cause they believed in. Sometimes it was connected to the hope of receiving spiritual benefits. The Templars received these donations because people trusted them. A noble who gave land to the order believed that his contribution would support the defense of the Holy Land. A merchant who worked with them believed that their reputation meant reliability. A traveler who depended on them believed that their network offered safety. Trust became their greatest resource. And that trust allowed the order to expand. Across Europe, Templar properties became centers of administration. Farms produced food. Workshops created supplies. Buildings stored resources. Managers kept records. The order became skilled at turning scattered possessions into a functioning network. This was not accidental. The same discipline that shaped their knights shaped their administration. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a role. Nothing was left entirely to chance. In many ways, the Templars became successful because they understood something that modern organizations also understand. A large institution cannot survive on enthusiasm alone. It needs systems. It needs communication. It needs people who know their responsibilities. The Templars developed those systems centuries before modern corporations existed. They created connections between distant regions. They managed resources across borders. They maintained a reputation that allowed strangers to trust them. And this reputation became perhaps their greatest achievement. Because money itself was not what made the Templars powerful. Money was only a tool. The true source of their influence was confidence. People believed they would fulfill their promises. They believed their agreements mattered. They believed the order represented stability in an uncertain world. And in medieval Europe, stability was incredibly valuable. But every great success creates new challenges. As the Templars grew richer, they became more visible. As they became more visible, they became more powerful. And as they became more powerful, people began paying closer attention. Some admired them. Some depended on them. Some respected them. But others began wondering whether any organization could become too influential. Could a brotherhood created to serve become powerful enough to threaten those around it? Could an organization loyal to the church and connected to kings truly remain independent forever? These questions would not be answered immediately. For now, the Templars continued their work. Their castles stood across important regions. Their ships crossed the Mediterranean. Their members protected travelers, managed estates, and served their mission. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ had become something nobody could have predicted. A military order. A religious community. A financial network. And soon, a major political force. Because wealth had given them influence. But influence would bring them into the center of conflicts far greater than any road they had ever protected. The next chapter would take us back to the world where the Templars first began. The Holy Land. A place of breathtaking beauty and constant struggle. Where castles stood against the horizon. Where armies crossed deserts. Where alliances changed with every season. And where the Knights Templar would face their greatest test. The Knights Templar had begun with a simple promise. Protect the traveler. Serve the faith. Stand between danger and those who could not defend themselves. But the world they lived in rarely allowed simple promises to remain simple. The roads of the Holy Land were not just paths between cities. They were lines connecting different worlds. Kingdoms. Religions. Cultures. Ambitions. Every fortress, every valley, and every trade route carried strategic importance. And slowly, the Templars discovered that protecting pilgrims required them to become something more. They had to become defenders of an entire kingdom. The Holy Land was beautiful. But it was also unforgiving. A traveler moving through the region could pass from fertile valleys into dry, rocky landscapes within a single day's journey. Great cities stood beside empty stretches of wilderness. Ancient roads crossed territories where armies had marched for centuries. The landscape itself shaped warfare. A castle built on a hilltop could control an entire region. A fortress guarding a mountain pass could determine whether armies moved freely or struggled to advance. A harbor could decide whether supplies arrived or disappeared. The Templars understood this reality. Their strength was not only found in individual knights. It was found in places. Stone walls. Watchtowers. Garrisons. Strategic locations. The castles of the Templars became symbols of their power. But these were not simply impressive buildings. They were machines designed for survival. Imagine approaching one of these fortresses for the first time. From a distance, it appears almost like part of the landscape itself. Massive stone walls rise from rocky ground. Towers watch silently over the surrounding area. The entrance is carefully protected. Every feature has a purpose. A fortress was not built to impress visitors. It was built because someone expected danger to arrive. Inside those walls lived a small world. Soldiers trained. Horses were cared for. Weapons were repaired. Food was stored. Messages arrived from distant locations. A castle had to survive even when isolated for long periods. The people inside could not simply walk to the nearest market whenever supplies became low. Everything mattered. A broken water system. A shortage of grain. A damaged gate. Any of these problems could become dangerous during a siege. The Templars became experts at this kind of preparation. Their discipline extended beyond individual warriors. It shaped entire communities. A Templar fortress functioned because everyone understood their role. The knight defending the wall. The cook preparing meals. The blacksmith repairing equipment. The messenger carrying information. The farmer providing food. All were connected. A fortress was not maintained by warriors alone. It survived because hundreds of people worked together. This was one reason the Templars became so effective. They understood organization. But castles alone could not protect the Holy Land. Eventually, armies would meet. And when they did, the Templars faced a difficult reality. Medieval warfare was not like the stories often told in legends. It was not a constant series of heroic charges and dramatic victories. Most of war was waiting. Preparing. Marching. Enduring. A knight could spend weeks inside a fortress without seeing an enemy. Then, within a single day, everything could change. A messenger could arrive with urgent news. An opposing army had crossed into the region. A city was under threat. A road was no longer safe. The quiet routines of fortress life could suddenly become preparation for battle. For the Templars, this was the world they had chosen. Their faith demanded devotion. Their vows demanded obedience. Their mission demanded courage. But courage did not mean they were fearless. It meant they continued despite uncertainty. Every knight understood the risks. A battle could end quickly. A siege could last months. A simple journey between two locations could become deadly. Yet they continued. Because to them, defending the Holy Land was not merely a political responsibility. It was a sacred duty. This belief explains much of their determination. Modern observers sometimes struggle to understand why medieval people were willing to sacrifice so much for religious causes. But to understand the Templars, we must understand their world. Faith was not a small part of life. It shaped decisions. It influenced kings. It inspired journeys across continents. For many Templars, their service was not simply a career. It was their purpose. And nowhere was that purpose tested more than on the battlefield. Because the greatest challenge facing the Knights Templar was not building castles. It was defending a kingdom surrounded by enemies. And soon, they would face battles that would define their reputation forever. A Templar knight preparing for battle was not simply preparing to fight. He was preparing to represent everything the order stood for. The white mantle. The red cross. The reputation of the brotherhood. All of these carried meaning. A knight who entered battle carried more than a sword. He carried the expectations of everyone who had placed their trust in the order. This responsibility shaped the way the Templars approached warfare. They were not ordinary soldiers searching for excitement or personal glory. Their rules demanded discipline. A knight was expected to remain calm. To obey commands. To hold his position. To protect his brothers. And perhaps most importantly, to avoid acting out of personal emotion. This was not always easy. Medieval battles were terrifying experiences. The sounds alone could overwhelm the senses. The movement of thousands of men and animals. The shouting of commanders. The impact of weapons. The cries of the wounded. The dust rising from countless footsteps and hooves. For a person standing in the middle of such chaos, training was the difference between survival and disaster. The Templars understood this. Their famous reputation did not come simply from bravery. Many people throughout history have been brave. Their reputation came from control. A Templar formation was valuable because it was organized. A group of knights moving together could accomplish far more than individual warriors acting alone. The strength was not one sword. It was many swords moving as one. The mounted charge became one of the most recognizable aspects of medieval warfare. A line of armored knights moving across open ground could create an overwhelming psychological effect. The sound alone was unforgettable. The ground trembling beneath hundreds of horses. Metal armor reflecting sunlight. Banners moving in the wind. The enemy watching as the distance disappeared. But the charge was not simply a moment of courage. It required timing. Discipline. Coordination. A poorly timed charge could destroy an army. A successful one could change the outcome of a battle. The Templars trained for this kind of warfare. But despite their reputation, they were not invincible. This is an important part of understanding their history. Later stories often transformed the Templars into almost mythical warriors. Men who could never be defeated. Knights who stood against impossible odds. But the real history is far more interesting. They won important battles. They also suffered devastating defeats. They were skilled. But they were still human. They lived in a world where decisions, weather, supplies, leadership, and simple chance could determine the outcome of a conflict. A brilliant commander could lose. A smaller force could survive. A powerful army could collapse. Nothing was guaranteed. This uncertainty defined life in the Crusader states. The Templars were constantly balancing between confidence and danger. Their castles created security. But they also existed in a vulnerable position. They were surrounded by powerful rivals who understood the importance of the same lands they fought to control. The Holy Land was not empty. It was not simply a stage where one side acted while the other waited. It was a region filled with cities, communities, cultures, and competing ambitions. The Templars found themselves living among people whose languages, traditions, and beliefs were different from their own. Their story took place in a world of constant interaction. Trade continued. Diplomacy continued. Messages crossed borders. Even during periods of conflict, people still negotiated, exchanged goods, and formed temporary agreements. This complexity is often lost when looking only at battles. The medieval Middle East was not simply a place of endless warfare. It was a place where different worlds met. And the Templars existed at the center of that meeting point. They needed warriors. But they also needed diplomats. They needed castles. But they also needed alliances. They needed courage. But they also needed patience. Their greatest challenge was not defeating one enemy. It was maintaining a fragile kingdom in an uncertain world. One of the most famous examples of this challenge came from their role in defending important fortresses. These castles were not just buildings. They were symbols. As long as certain fortresses remained in Christian hands, the Crusader states could continue. If they fell, the entire balance of power could change. The Templars understood what was at stake. Every wall they defended represented something larger than stone. It represented a connection between distant communities. A road for pilgrims. A place of worship. A reminder that the Crusader presence in the region still existed. But defending such places came with a heavy cost. Life inside a frontier fortress could be lonely. Months might pass without major events. Then suddenly, everything changed. A messenger would arrive. An army was approaching. Supplies needed to be prepared. Weapons distributed. Defenses strengthened. The peaceful rhythm of daily life disappeared almost instantly. The men inside the fortress knew what might come next. A siege. Perhaps days. Perhaps weeks. Perhaps longer. The waiting could be as difficult as the fighting itself. And yet, this was the life they had chosen. The Templars were not created for comfort. They were created for responsibility. Their story became one of endurance. Not only because they could fight, but because they could continue. Through uncertainty. Through loss. Through changing fortunes. For several generations, they would remain one of the most important forces defending the Crusader states. But history was already beginning to shift. The same lands they fought to protect were becoming harder to hold. And the greatest challenge facing the Templars would not come from a single battle. It would come from a changing world. For many years, the Knights Templar represented the strength of the Crusader states. Their banners flew above castles. Their knights guarded important roads. Their ships carried supplies across the Mediterranean. Their commanders advised rulers and defended strategic locations. To many supporters in Europe, the Templars represented something permanent. Something that could endure. But history rarely remains unchanged. The same world that had allowed the Templars to rise was beginning to transform. The Crusader states had always existed in a difficult position. They were surrounded by powerful neighbors. They depended on reinforcements from Europe. They required careful diplomacy. And they needed constant resources to maintain their defenses. For a time, the system worked. But gradually, the balance began to shift. New leaders emerged in the region. Rival powers became more organized. The unity that had once allowed the Crusader states to survive became increasingly difficult to maintain. The Templars could defend walls. They could train soldiers. They could hold important positions. But even the strongest fortress depends on the world around it. And that world was changing. One of the most important changes came with the rise of powerful Muslim leaders who sought to unite territories that had previously been divided. Among them was Saladin. A skilled military commander and political leader, Saladin would become one of the most significant figures of the medieval era. His rise changed the balance of power in the region. The Crusader states were no longer facing scattered opposition. They faced a more coordinated challenge. For the Templars, this meant their role became even more demanding. The roads they protected became more dangerous. The castles they defended became more important. The battles they fought became more decisive. Their reputation grew stronger. But so did the cost of maintaining it. Every victory required resources. Every defeat required recovery. Every night lost represented years of training and experience disappearing. The Templars had always understood sacrifice. It was part of their identity. But now the sacrifices were becoming greater. The Holy Land demanded more than devotion. It demanded constant endurance. Perhaps the most difficult part of their story is that they were not failing because they lacked courage. They were facing a challenge larger than any single group could easily solve. The Crusader states were thousands of miles from much of their support base. Communication was slow. Supplies were expensive. Political disagreements were common. Even among those defending the same cause, different leaders often had different goals. The Templars remained committed. But commitment alone could not stop history from moving. Over time, important territories were lost. Cities that had once seemed secure became vulnerable. The Christian presence in the region became increasingly difficult to maintain. And then came one of the most symbolic moments in the story of the Crusades. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187. The city that had inspired countless journeys. The destination that had brought pilgrims across oceans and deserts. The place that had given birth to the Templars' original mission. Was once again outside Christian control. For the Templars, this was not simply a military defeat. It was a deeply personal loss. The city represented everything they had dedicated their lives to protecting. Yet the story did not end there. The Templars continued. They adapted. They fought. They helped defend what remained of the Crusader presence in the region. Their castles became even more important. Their determination became even more legendary. But the world was moving toward a different future. The era that had created the Knights Templar was slowly disappearing. The great Crusader kingdoms were becoming weaker. The political landscape was changing. And eventually, the Templars would face a new kind of enemy. Not an army approaching their walls. Not a rival kingdom crossing the battlefield. But a powerful king sitting thousands of miles away. Who would decide that the Templars had become too influential? The greatest threat to the Knights Templar would not come from outside the walls. It would come from within Europe itself. The Knights Templar had survived many dangers. They had crossed deserts. They had defended castles. They had fought on distant battlefields. They had watched kingdoms rise and fall around them. For nearly 2 centuries, they had adapted to a changing world. But the greatest threat they would ever face would not arrive with an army. It would not appear on the horizon with banners and weapons. It would come quietly. Through letters. Through accusations. Through political decisions made inside royal chambers far away from the battlefields where the Templars had earned their reputation. By the beginning of the 14th century, the world that created the Knights Templar had changed dramatically. The great age of the Crusader kingdoms was fading. The Holy Land, which had once been the center of their mission, was no longer controlled by Christian rulers. The Templars still existed. They still owned lands. They still maintained their organization. They still possessed wealth and influence. But their original purpose had become more complicated. The question that had quietly followed them for years was becoming harder to ignore. If the Holy Land could no longer be protected, what was the true purpose of the Knights Templar? This was not simply a question asked by enemies. It was a question facing medieval Europe itself. The world was changing. Kings were becoming more powerful. National identities were beginning to develop. Monarchs wanted greater control over their territories. The influence of independent organizations became increasingly uncomfortable for rulers who wanted authority concentrated in their own hands. And among those rulers was the King of France, Philip IV. Known to history as Philip the Fair. Philip was one of the most powerful monarchs of his time. He ruled a wealthy kingdom. He had ambitious plans. He wanted France to be stronger, more centralized, and more independent. But achieving those goals required something every ruler needed: money. And this was where his relationship with the Knights Templar became complicated. Running a medieval kingdom was enormously expensive. Armies required payment. Fortresses required maintenance. Government officials needed support. Wars could consume enormous amounts of resources. A king could have land. A king could have authority. But without financial resources, even the strongest ruler faced limitations. Philip struggled with these pressures. Throughout his reign, he made several attempts to increase royal income and strengthen his position. These decisions sometimes brought him into conflict with powerful groups. And eventually, one of those groups would be the Knights Templar. The relationship between Philip and the Templars was not always hostile. In fact, the order had served the French monarchy in important ways. The Templars had protected royal finances. They had supported rulers. They had been trusted by nobles throughout Europe. But power creates complicated relationships. An organization admired by some could appear threatening to others. The Templars were unique. They answered to the Church. They operated across kingdoms. They controlled significant wealth. They had their own leadership structure. They possessed military experience. From one perspective, these qualities made them valuable. From another perspective, they made them difficult to control. And for a king who wanted greater authority, independence could look like a threat. The situation became even more complicated after the loss of the Crusader states. The Templars had originally been created for a specific mission: protecting the Holy Land, defending pilgrims, supporting Christian territories in the East. But after the fall of important Crusader strongholds, many Europeans began questioning the future of military orders. Should they continue? Should they merge? Should their wealth be redirected? Should their purpose change? These debates created uncertainty. And uncertainty creates vulnerability. For the first time in their history, the Templars were not simply fighting enemies outside their walls. They were facing questions about their place in the world. They had survived because they adapted. But now adaptation was becoming more difficult. Their wealth remained. Their reputation remained. Their organization remained. But the world around them was no longer the same world that had created them. And slowly, a dangerous situation was developing. A powerful king. A wealthy independent order. A changing political landscape. And a series of events that would soon transform admiration into suspicion. Because the Knights Templar had spent generations building their reputation. But reputation alone could not protect them from a determined enemy. And soon, their greatest challenge would begin. For centuries, the Knights Templar had built something rare: trust. That trust was their greatest achievement. But it was also their greatest vulnerability. Because when an organization becomes powerful, people begin looking at it differently. A small group of devoted knights protecting pilgrims could inspire admiration. A wealthy international order with its own leadership, its own properties, and connections across Europe could create questions. And in the early 14th century, those questions became increasingly important. The relationship between the French crown and the Templars became more complicated as Philip IV continued trying to strengthen royal authority. The king had already shown that he was willing to challenge powerful institutions when he believed they limited his control. He had conflicts with the papacy. He had disagreements with wealthy groups. He had repeatedly attempted to place the interests of the French monarchy above competing powers. The Templars were different from many of these groups. They were not simply wealthy landowners. They were a religious military order. Their members had sworn obedience to their own leadership and ultimately to the Church. This independence had helped them survive for generations. But independence also meant they were not easily controlled. And that created tension. At the same time, the Templars' original mission had become uncertain. The loss of the Crusader states had changed everything. When the order was founded, its purpose seemed clear. Protect Jerusalem. Protect pilgrims. Defend Christian territories in the East. But after major defeats and the final loss of Christian control in the Holy Land, many people began asking difficult questions. What should happen next? Should the military orders continue? Should they combine into one larger organization? Should their wealth be redirected toward another crusade? These debates placed the Templars in an uncomfortable position. They were still wealthy. Still organized. Still respected. But the world no longer saw them with the same certainty. Their greatest strength, their independence, was now becoming something some people viewed with suspicion. There was another challenge as well. The Templars were surrounded by rumors. Powerful organizations often attract stories. Some were based on misunderstandings. Some came from jealousy. Some were simply the result of people trying to explain something they did not fully understand. The Templars had secret ceremonies because they were a closed religious order. They had their own rules. They had private meetings. They managed enormous resources. To outsiders, these things could appear mysterious. And mystery can easily become suspicion. But it is important to understand the historical reality. The accusations that eventually destroyed the Templars were not simply the natural result of rumors. They were connected to politics. They emerged at a moment when powerful people had reasons to challenge the order. And once accusations began, they would spread quickly. The medieval world did not have modern systems for investigating claims. Reputation mattered enormously. A person accused of wrongdoing could face severe consequences even before the truth was fully examined. The Templars, despite their long history of service, were not immune to this. Their enemies understood something important. The order's greatest weakness was not its military strength. It was its reputation. If people stopped believing in them, their power could collapse. And soon, a carefully planned campaign would begin. The same symbols that had once inspired confidence would be questioned. The same ceremonies that had represented dedication would be interpreted differently. The same wealth that had made them valuable would become a reason for others to desire their possessions. The Templars had spent nearly 2 centuries building their legacy. But destroying a reputation could happen much faster than creating one. And the first signs of this storm were already appearing. Behind the walls of their commanderies, the brothers continued their routines. They prayed. They managed their estates. They maintained their properties. Many had no idea that events were unfolding around them that would change their lives forever. They had faced armies before. They had defended castles. They had survived the fall of kingdoms. But they were not prepared for an enemy that did not arrive with weapons. An enemy that arrived with accusations. The morning of October 13, 1307, began like many other mornings across France. In towns and villages, people woke to ordinary routines. Markets opened. Church bells rang. Farmers worked their fields. Merchants prepared for another day of trade. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening. Orders had been sent. Letters had been prepared. Officials across the kingdom had received instructions. Their target was the Knights Templar. The operation was carefully planned. At the same time, officials moved against Templar houses throughout France. Many brothers had no warning. For generations, they had been respected members of medieval society. They had served kings. They had protected travelers. They had managed important responsibilities. Yet suddenly, they found themselves accused. The speed of the operation was shocking. The organization that had survived wars, political conflicts, and the collapse of the Crusader states was now facing a different kind of attack. Not an attack on its castles. An attack on its reputation. The accusations brought against the Templars were extremely serious. They were accused of crimes against their faith and their vows. The claims were shocking to medieval society. If believed, they suggested that an organization created in the name of religion had secretly betrayed the very principles it claimed to defend. The impact was enormous. The Templars' identity had always depended on trust. Their white mantle represented purity. Their reputation represented honor. Their connection to the church represented legitimacy. Now all of those things were being questioned. However, historians continue to debate many aspects of the accusations and the trials. Some accusations came from testimonies collected during investigations. But the circumstances surrounding those testimonies were complicated. Medieval investigations could involve intense pressure, and modern historians are careful when evaluating the reliability of the evidence. The downfall of the Templars was not simply a straightforward story of guilt and punishment. It was also a story of politics, power, and competing interests. King Philip IV had reasons to weaken the order. The Templars possessed wealth. They operated independently. They answered to a wider religious authority. Their existence represented a kind of power that did not easily fit into Philip's vision of a stronger French monarchy. But destroying the Templars required more than royal authority. They were a religious order. The Church had recognized them. Their fate could not be decided by a king alone. The situation eventually reached Pope Clement V. At first, the relationship between the papacy and the French king was complicated. The Pope faced pressure from multiple directions. He had to consider the accusations. He had to consider the political reality. And he had to decide what should happen to an organization that had existed for almost 2 centuries. Meanwhile, the Templars waited. Brothers who had spent their lives following orders now found themselves facing uncertainty. Some were imprisoned. Some were questioned. Some continued defending their innocence. The world they had known was disappearing. The castles remained. The wealth remained. The symbols remained. But the Brotherhood itself was breaking apart. Perhaps the most tragic part of the story is how quickly everything changed. For generations, the Templars had represented stability in an unstable world. They had been the people others trusted when roads were dangerous. Now they themselves needed protection. The hunters had become the hunted. The defenders needed defending. And eventually, after years of investigation and political pressure, the order that had survived for nearly 2 centuries was officially dissolved. In 1312, Pope Clement V issued a decree suppressing the Knights Templar. The decision ended the existence of one of medieval history's most remarkable organizations. But it did not end the story. Because when powerful institutions disappear, questions remain. What happened to their wealth? What happened to their members? Did some continue under different names? Did their secrets survive? Was their treasure ever found? For centuries, people would continue searching for answers. Some stories would grow into legends. Some mysteries would become impossible to separate from imagination. But behind all those legends was a very real group of people. Men who had lived by strict rules. Men who had traveled across continents. Men who had built castles, protected roads, and shaped medieval history. The Knights Templar had fallen. But they had not been forgotten. And perhaps that is the strangest part of their story. Many powerful kingdoms have disappeared into history. Many rulers have been forgotten. Many battles have lost their meaning. Yet a brotherhood that lasted less than 2 centuries continues to capture the imagination of people around the world. Because the greatest mystery of the Knights Templar is not only how they disappeared. It is why we still remember them. When the Knights Templar officially disappeared, history seemed to close a chapter. A brotherhood that had lasted nearly 2 centuries was gone. The white mantles disappeared from European roads. The banners that had flown above castles were lowered. The meetings that had once filled Templar halls with prayers and discussions came to an end. But the disappearance of the order did not mean the disappearance of its members. This is where the story becomes more complicated. Because organizations can end on paper, while people continue living. Thousands of men had been connected to the Templars. Not all were imprisoned. Not all faced the same fate. Not all disappeared into mystery. Some former Templars found new places within European society. After the suppression of the order, much of its property was transferred to other religious institutions, especially the Knights Hospitaller. This was not the dramatic treasure hunt that later legends would describe. It was a practical transfer of land, buildings, and resources. The medieval world continued moving. Castles needed owners. Farms needed managers. Properties needed administration. Life did not stop simply because one organization had ended. For many former Templars, the transition was difficult. They had spent years, perhaps decades, belonging to a brotherhood that defined every part of their existence. Their clothing. Their prayers. Their daily routines. Their friendships. Their purpose. Imagine waking one morning and discovering that the institution that had shaped your entire adult life no longer existed. The fortress where you lived was no longer truly yours. The symbol you wore had become a reminder of a lost past. The brothers beside you were no longer part of the same recognized order. For some men, this must have felt like losing not only a position, but an identity. And yet, many adapted. Some joined other religious communities. Some returned to ordinary life. Some continued serving as knights. The men who had once been called Templars became part of a larger story about how people survive when the world they know disappears. But while the real people moved forward, the legends were only beginning. Because whenever a famous organization disappears suddenly, people naturally ask questions. What was lost? What was hidden? What remained unknown? The Knights Templar had left behind something even more powerful than wealth. They left behind mystery. And mystery has a way of growing. Over the centuries, stories began appearing about what might have happened to the Order's treasures. Some claim that the Templars had hidden enormous wealth before their arrests. Others searched for lost documents, secret knowledge, or forgotten artifacts. Some legends connected them to ancient religious objects. Others suggested secret survival. These stories became fascinating. But they also created a challenge. Separating history from imagination. The real Knights Templar were already remarkable enough. They did not need fictional additions to become interesting. A group of knights who protected pilgrims. Who built castles. Who managed an international network. Who advised kings. and who disappeared after a dramatic political struggle, was already one of the most extraordinary stories of the medieval world. Yet human beings have always been drawn to unanswered questions. A mystery invites us to imagine. And the Templars left behind many unanswered questions. Perhaps the most famous question is simple. Where did all their wealth go? The answer is more complicated than many legends suggest. Much of their property was identified, transferred, or absorbed by other institutions. Some possessions disappeared during the chaos surrounding their downfall. Some records were incomplete. Some treasures may have been lost simply because medieval record-keeping was never perfect. History often leaves gaps. And those gaps create space for stories. Perhaps no name is more closely connected with the final days of the Knights Templar than Jacques de Molay. He was the last Grand Master of the Order. The man who carried the responsibility of leading the Templars during their darkest hours. Before his arrest, Jacques de Molay had lived the life of a Templar leader. He had traveled across the medieval world. He had commanded knights. He had represented the order before powerful figures. He had inherited the responsibility of protecting an institution that had existed for nearly 2 centuries. But by the time he became Grand Master, the world around the Templars had changed dramatically. The age that created them was disappearing. The Crusader states were gone. The great campaigns of earlier generations had faded into memory. And the order itself was facing questions about its future. De Molay did not become the leader of the Templars during their greatest triumph. He became their leader during their uncertainty. Yet even then, few could have imagined what was coming. When the arrests began in France, Jacques de Molay was taken into custody. The man who had once commanded one of Europe's most respected military organizations was suddenly a prisoner. The contrast was extraordinary. A Grand Master who had stood before kings now stood before interrogators. A leader who had represented strength now depended on others for his own safety. The years that followed were filled with investigations, accusations, and political pressure. The Templars defended themselves. The process surrounding their trials has remained one of the most debated episodes in medieval history. Some accusations were later questioned by historians. Some confessions were obtained under circumstances that make their reliability difficult to evaluate. The truth of exactly what happened inside those investigations remains complicated. But one thing is clear. The Templars' reputation had been severely damaged. And once reputation disappears, even the strongest institutions become vulnerable. In 1314, after years of imprisonment and controversy, Jacques de Molay was executed in Paris. According to later accounts, he maintained his innocence until the end. Over time, his final moments became surrounded by legend. One famous story claims that he placed a curse upon those responsible for the destruction of the order. According to the legend, King Philip IV and Pope Clement V would soon face their own deaths. The story became one of the most famous parts of Templar mythology. But historians treat such accounts carefully. The exact words spoken by de Molay are uncertain. The dramatic curse story became more popular in later centuries, when people were already fascinated by the mystery surrounding the Templars. And perhaps that is the pattern that followed the order throughout history. The facts were already fascinating. But people continued adding new layers of mystery. The real Jacques de Molay was not a magician. He was not a keeper of supernatural secrets. He was a medieval leader caught in a political storm. A man who inherited a powerful organization at the moment when the world had begun moving beyond it. His death marked the symbolic end of the Knights Templar. But the idea of the Templars survived. And that may be the most interesting part of their story. Because organizations can disappear. Buildings can collapse. Documents can be lost. But stories are much harder to destroy. The Templars continued living in the imagination of future generations. Writers wondered about them. Historians studied them. Adventurers searched for traces of them. Every unanswered question became an invitation for another story. What happened to their treasures? Did some members continue secretly? Were important documents hidden away? Did the order leave behind knowledge that was never recovered? Many of these questions remain surrounded by speculation. But perhaps the greatest mystery is not what the Templars left behind. It is why they continue to fascinate us. Because their story contains something that feels almost timeless. A small group of ordinary people creating something extraordinary. A brotherhood built on discipline and sacrifice. A rise from poverty to influence. A sudden fall that changed history forever. The Knights Templar remind us that power is never permanent. Even the strongest institutions can disappear. Even the most respected names can be questioned. And even after centuries pass, some stories refuse to fade. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Knights Templar is that their story survived long after their organization disappeared. The men who wore the white mantle are gone. The castles they defended have become ancient ruins. The roads they protected have changed beyond recognition. The kingdoms they served no longer exist in the same form. Yet their name remains. More than 7 centuries have passed since the final days of the Order, but people are still fascinated by these medieval knights. Why? Perhaps because the Templars represent a question that humans have always asked. What happens when ordinary people dedicate themselves completely to something greater than themselves? The first Templars were not powerful. They were not wealthy. They were not famous. They were simply 9 knights who believed that protecting travelers was worth their lives. From that small beginning came something extraordinary. A brotherhood that connected distant lands. A community built around discipline. An organization that influenced religion, politics, warfare, and finance. Their story reminds us that history is often shaped by people who cannot see the future they are creating. Hugh de Payens and his companions could not have imagined what their simple promise would become. The pilgrims they protected could not have known that the knights beside them would one day become legendary. The brothers living inside Templar fortresses could not have known that centuries later, people would still debate their mysteries. They were simply living their lives. Following their rules. Carrying out their duties. Trying to serve a purpose they believed mattered. And perhaps that is what makes their story so human. Because beneath the legends, beneath the treasure stories, beneath the mysteries, there were real people. Men who woke before sunrise. Men who prayed together. Men who cared for horses and repaired armor. Men who experienced friendship, fear, hope, and uncertainty. Men who believed their actions had meaning. The myths surrounding the Templars will probably never disappear completely. There will always be new theories about hidden treasures. New stories about forgotten secrets. New questions about what might have happened after their fall. And perhaps that is part of the reason they remain so fascinating. Mystery invites imagination. But history gives us something even more valuable. Understanding. The true story of the Knights Templar does not need impossible legends to make it extraordinary. A group of knights who began by protecting pilgrims. Who built an international network. Who became trusted by kings. Who shaped medieval history. And who disappeared during one of the most dramatic political struggles of their age. Is already an incredible story. Their greatest mystery may not be what they hid. It may be what they revealed. They revealed how powerful an idea can become. How a small group can influence the world. And how even the greatest achievements of humanity can eventually become memories. Today, when we look at old castles standing quietly across Europe and the Middle East, we are looking at more than stones. We are looking at reminders. Reminders of a world where journeys were difficult. Where faith shaped decisions. Where courage was tested daily. and where a small brotherhood of knights began a story that would echo for centuries. The Knights Templar are gone. But their journey remains. A journey that began on a dangerous road outside Jerusalem and continued through the pages of history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the entire story of the Knights Templar. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, consider subscribing to Into Ease. And let us know in the comments. What historical story would you like to explore next? Until next time. Rest well, and keep discovering the stories that shaped our world.